Can the international community set up a Bretton Woods 3? I think it would be incredibly difficult. I mean, right now, no other country is volunteering to have its currency serve as the reserve currency. They're running away from it. And so by default, the United States continues to have the reserve currency. But you can do things in the spirit of Bretton Woods. You could just get rid of a lot of the toxic financial instruments. That can be done by national regulation. You go back to the period before 1980, there were no hedge funds, there was no private equity, there were no credit default swaps, there was no shadow banking, and the economy worked just fine. The economy worked a lot better. So I think drastically simplifying finance, simplifying it to the point where you can understand it and you can regulate it and you can reduce its political power, that would help. I think a Tobin tax would help immensely, a tax on, small tax on financial transactions, especially of the international speculative sort, that would take the profit out of that whole line of work. So I don't know if you could go all the way to something like a Bretton Woods, but you can certainly get the role of speculative finance in undoing everything else that we need to do to regulate capitalism. You can get that substantially weakened. I'm not pretending any of this is easy. I'm just saying it just might be possible.
Surely this begs the question, how does labor become international around labor standards, human rights, and economic rights? I think that's, to me, the only antidote. If we have a world with these kinds of setups that you have mentioned, then we now, working people from country to, we don't need to see Mexican workers as our enemies. That's currently how it's posited. Jobs going to Mexico and they're enemies. Why not make the Mexican workers get paid, higher wages and better conditions so capital doesn't float around the world living off, on that cost basis to the same extent. So internationalization of labor.
Let me make a couple of comments because this is very tricky. As you probably know, a lot of leaders of developing countries are very skeptical of international labor standards because they see it as the way that the developed North can discriminate against their ability to use one of the few things that they have to become competitive, which is low wages. I think core ILO standards, beginning with the right to organize a union, that's the single most important thing because then you're leaving it up to workers of these countries to use their own power and build their own power to improve living standards rather than having us in the North say that the international minimum wage has to be X. I also think that, yes, the offset to finance is labor, absolutely, but you also have to regulate finance because it's necessary to regulate finance. So I think both things are necessary. And you may recall that the original Bretton Woods Agreement imagined not just a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund, but it envisaged an International Trade Organization, an ITO, that was the polar opposite of the current WTO. Because the ITO specified that it was the right of a country, if its ability to have decent labor standards were threatened by imports, it could impose tariffs. So the sensibility of the people who brought us Bretton Woods included not just the need to constrain capital, but the need to empower labor and not have the rebuilding of trade serve as a way of undercutting labor. But this is very, very, very difficult. You take the case of U.S.-Mexico. There's no other country, there's no other border in the world where the disparity between wages on one side of the border and wages on the other side of the border is so extreme. And to try and bring free trade, unregulated trade, to that sort of situation has to create a race to the bottom. That's the law of one price. That's how markets work. And so I think the challenge is to restore the ability, nation by nation, to build decent economies with decent labor and human rights and social standards. I meant to say something about climate change, and let me just take a moment to do that. Nicholas Stern, Lord Stern of the famous Stern report, was quoted as saying that climate change is history's greatest case of market failure. And I would add to that financial collapses are history's second greatest case of market failure. Markets price things wrong. They price carbon wrong. They price toxic securities wrong. They price labor wrong. And the only way to countermand that is to have stronger democracy. So, you know, I pose the question in this book, can democracy survive global capitalism? The only way to answer that question in the affirmative is to have much stronger democracy and much weaker capital.
Where did the left go wrong in the 60s and 70s? I mean, clearly we entered this period of rising inflation, stagflation, and there was a left response out there from people like Tony Benn and Rudolf Meidner in Sweden that, you know, if private investment was lagging, we should really shift ownership. I'm just wondering what your take is on that period and how the left helped create an opening for neoliberalism, or at least why it took us 30 years to develop a response.
It's a very good question. So let's look at what actually happened in the 70s. I referred to the role of luck, good luck or bad luck. There was a lot of bad luck in what happened in the 70s. And this is not to excuse the response of center-left parties, so-called, but let's just take a minute to recall what occurred. You had the collapse of Bretton Woods. There was an economist named Triffin who wrote about the Triffin dilemma. The Triffin dilemma was the fact that the dollar cannot indefinitely go on being a domestic currency and being a global currency without incurring inflation. And that came home to roost in the period 1971 to 1973. Nixon, who was preoccupied with saving his skin, which he failed to save in Watergate, was not particularly interested in a gentle reform of Bretton Woods, and so the whole thing came crashing down. That, in turn, coupled with the 1973 Mideast War, led to the OPEC rise in oil prices, which in turn led to stagnation, stagflation rather, which in turn led to center-left parties getting blamed for mismanaging the economy. So that opens the door to, first, the resurrection of what came to be called neoliberal ideas, classically liberal ideas about maybe it's not such a good idea to manage the economy. And it opens the door to Reagan and Thatcher. Now, at that point, social democratic parties, center-left parties, are faced with a choice of becoming more left-wing or trying to accommodate to Thatcher and Reagan. And we all know what happened. They chose the course of thinking that if public opinion had moved more to the right, maybe they needed to move more to the right. And Meidner, whose plan was absolutely brilliant for socialization of the Swedish economy through worker funds that would gradually get a share of Swedish profits so that they would eventually own a majority of the Swedish economy, that led to a split in the Social Democratic Party. And the finance minister argued him down. And so the Meidner position did not become the majority position. Likewise, Benn and the Labor Party. So these were difficult times to navigate. And I think in retrospect, we can first of all say that the road not taken was the right road, but we can also point to Mitterrand, right? This is 1981, who did try to do the right thing. And the power of international finance to stage what my Marxian friends call a capital strike was so overwhelming that even in a large country like France, Mitterrand could not do what needed to be done. And so the rules of the game had been already shifted, thanks to the resurgent power of finance, against social democratic parties pursuing left-wing policies. That was the argument, by the way, that the finance minister made against Rudolf Meidner. that if you do this, international capital will avoid Sweden. And we are an open economy, and we depend on trade, and blah, blah, blah. And so the left of that era just lost those fights. And then, of course, Blair, Schroeder, Clinton doubled down on trying to be even more neoliberal than the neoliberals. And of course, the power and money are major characters in this story. Clinton got richly rewarded for giving Wall Street what it wanted. And same story with Schroeder, who became a very rich man. Same story with Blair. So the corruption of the center-left is part of this. And there's one other element. And this is delicate. So during this period, center-left parties are becoming more like right-wing parties on economic issues, and they're becoming further left on social issues. This is not a good combination. You know, Hillary Clinton lost the white working class vote by 39 points. She lost the white working class women's vote by 27 points. And you ask, well, how could that possibly have happened? And the average working class voter felt that Hillary Clinton cared more about the rules for toilets and cared more about rights for immigrants than about the economic conditions of locals. So if you want to be avant-garde on social issues, you have to put pocketbook issues first. And one of my heroes in the United States is a senator from Ohio named Sherrod Brown, who decided not to run for president for personal reasons. But Sherrod Brown was the only Democrat to get elected statewide in Ohio in 2018. And Sherrod Brown is the sponsor of a resolution to designate June as LGBTQ month. How did he do this? Well, he does this because he doesn't lead with that. He leads with, let's have policies that help the working class get decent jobs. And so socially conservative working class voters know that he has their back, and they're willing to forgive him for having avant-garde views on gay rights, abortion rights, pick your social issue. But if you lead with the social issues and ignore the pocketbook issues, then you are going to be clobbered by people like Donald Trump. Yep. Universal basic income. I think it's part of it. I don't think it's a silver bullet. I think people need work. People want work. You can supplement good jobs with a universal basic income, but to put all of your eggs in that basket, I think is a tactical mistake. I think the whole idea of a so-called Green New Deal, one part of which would be decarbonization, another part of which would be significant investment in what used to be called public works, would produce lots of good jobs. And then you top them up with universal basic income, but you don't rely on universal basic income as a substitute for the lack of decent jobs, because then, you know, you get people who are in work being played off against people who they think they're subsidizing who haven't earned it, and then you split your coalition.
In your book, you refer to the disproportionately low voter turnout and public discourse among the poor and the less affluent in the United States compared to the affluent. Is this not a major impediment for a move towards democracy? And what do you think about compulsory voting legislation such as they have in Australia?
Yeah. I'm not opposed to it. I think it might help, but I think the more important thing is to motivate voters. Something very exciting happened in the United States in 2018. Despite all of the voter suppression, despite all of the gerrymandering, despite the attempt to rig the results, the Democrats took back 43 Republican seats in the House. That was the biggest pickup by a Democratic Congress since the Watergate election of 1974. And the reason that happened was not primarily because people who had voted Republican in 2016 were disgusted with Trump and flipped over, although there was some of it. The biggest reason that happened was a massive increase in turnout. A massive increase in turnout among young people and among African Americans. And so, you know, there's a phenomenon in American politics where turnout is not very good by OECD standards, but it's almost respectable in presidential years, and then it's very, very low in these off-year elections. So in the most immediately preceding off-year election, which was 2014, turnout was 37%. In 2018, that went up to 50%, which broke a century-old record. And young voters voted for the Democrat by a margin of 2 to 1. And one of the reasons that Trump won was that turnout among African Americans and poor people, which had been high in the two Obama elections of 2008 and 2012, fell dramatically in 2016 because Hillary Clinton was not particularly inspiring to African Americans or to poor people. So it seems to me that there's a volatility to the turnout factor. And you have a galvanizing candidate who actually looks like she can improve people's lives, then African Americans, young people, poor people, who tend to vote at lower levels than middle-aged rich people, turn out at higher rates. I mean, the punchline of my newer book is that the only way Democrats are going to win is to run as economic populists. Partly because that bridges over schisms of race. Trump is trying to racialize the election. You de-racialize the election, not by ignoring race, but by pointing out commonalities that working people of all races have, and by making that the focus.
Bob, help someone like me who's not really schooled in international political economy to understand the social democratic counterfactual to free trade or free movement of capital. The historic counterfactual that I carry around in my head is tariff walls, capital controls. Trump, in fact, has joined the war against free trade, and Canadians haven't liked that very much. So, but can you sort of give some concrete guidance on this? I'm thinking also of Sweden, which has always been an open economy.
Right. So there's no such thing as free trade. All trade has rules. Yeah. The question is who writes the rules and in whose interest are the rules. And in the period before about 1990, the rules allowed relatively free commerce with some tariffs around the edges to coexist with a domestic managed form of capitalism. Today, quote, free trade is being used to demolish the ability of countries to regulate capitalism, NAFTA Chapter 11 being a case in point. Now, the Swedish case is so interesting because I have been in a number of conferences with Swedish trade unionists. And the argument, I'm going to caricature this, so forgive me if anyone is of Swedish extraction, but the argument always goes like this. You Americans, you want protectionism because all of your other policies are so terrible, but we Swedes, we're a trading nation, and we have figured out how to reconcile our support for free trade with our ability to have social democracy. Well, that storyline has been overtaken by events. The European Court of Justice has now said that if an Estonian company moves into Sweden and undercuts the wages of a Swedish collective bargaining agreement, and the LO goes on strike against that company, they are violating the company's rights under the Maastricht Treaty. Okay? So, nice little cameo example. If you get control of the rules of trade, you undermine the ability of even the most resolutely social democratic country in the world to have social democracy. And I could give you lots of other examples. So it's not free trade as if there were such a thing versus protectionism. It's what sort of rules for commerce, domestically and globally, operate that create plenty of space to regulate capitalism. The thing I've never quite understood in my 50-year argument with free traders is that people who will acknowledge that markets create catastrophes of instability and income inequality and dirty air and water and climate disaster and you name it. And centrist, Larry Summers will acknowledge this. Centrist economists will acknowledge that markets actually are not perfect. But somehow, once commerce crosses borders, markets become perfect again. How can that possibly be? How can both things be true?
I appreciate your commitment to putting a human face on capitalism. And there's no question that the 60s are the best evidence that exists that that's possible. But a cynic might say that insofar as it was possible, it was only possible by the evisceration of democracy within working class institutions. The expulsion of progressives from the labor movement and the shift to highly undemocratic internal structures, which, when they were finally challenged in the 60s, called into question a lot of what had been achieved. So am I being too cynical? And as a follow-up, in the context of the climate crisis, what exactly would be the human face?
No, you're not being too cynical. And if I was understood to have argued that it's possible to put a human face on capitalism, I was misunderstood. I think the controls on capitalism, particularly on finance, need to be even more rigid and more extreme than they were in the post-war boom, because obviously they weren't extreme enough, because the capitalists managed to break all of those constraints and return to something like the 1920s or the 1890s. So you need a much more robust labor movement. You need a much more robust set of public institutions, including public capital, including public ownership, because whatever we achieved in the 1960s, history has shown, did not go nearly far enough. Now, the purge of communists and other radicals from the labor movement is a disgrace, because, as everybody knows, radicals make the best organizers. And Western Europe is really interesting in this regard, because this is a chapter of the post-war recovery that has been airbrushed out of most histories. In 1946, 1947, 1948, communists served in government, and then the Cold War happens, and they're kicked out of government, but they continue to play a very strong role in the European labor movement, in France and Italy and Belgium in particular. And that has the effect of pushing centrist governments to the left in order to compete with both domestic communists and to compete with Stalin. So so I don't think trade unionists ought to be expelling people because they're radicals. Easy for me to say in hindsight. I mean, I've read the history books. Some of those battles were just extremely vicious. But it was the more radical unions in the United States that hung in and did the tough organizing longer than anybody else. And I say that, I guess you'd call me a democratic socialist, not a communist, but I think what was done, I don't know the Canadian story, I do know the American story, in that era to radicals in the labor movement, which is wrong.
I just want to ask a simple question. You didn't at all allude to the Green New Deal.
I
Although
did in
this-
passing.
You did it very fast because
I'll do it.
I just want some, what's your opinion about that, especially with regards to the financing?
Well, I think the magazine that I edit, we're publishing a whole special edition just on the Green New Deal. I have been collecting blueprints that call themselves Green New Deal just so I can understand the debate. There are about 30 of them that I've collected so far. As I understand the meaning of a Green New Deal, it means drastic steps towards total decarbonization by circa 2040, 2045, combined with massive investments in public infrastructure, some of which is explicitly green, some of which is just replacing century-old infrastructure. I think it's an urgently needed strategy to get on a better track with climate, to create good jobs, to reclaim industrial jobs in particular. And I think it should be the absolute centerpiece of what I hope the next President of the United States will do. So it's also an example of the urgently needed public investment that we don't have. I mean, private capital is sitting on trillions of dollars that it doesn't know what to do with. And we have been, thanks to Trump, we now know that enormous deficits don't matter. We have huge deficits, trillion-dollar deficits in the United States, the lowest real interest rates on record. The interest rates are below the Fed's inflation target, or the inflation rates below the Fed's inflation target. So for those who follow this stuff, I think modern monetary theory, so-called, overstates it. I don't think you can print an infinite amount of money. But I think the response to the financial collapse of 2008 shows that the central bank, in circumstances of unrealized economic opportunity, can create a huge amount of liquidity, which in that case went to shore up and bail out the banks. In this case, would go for bona fide public investment without having any negative consequences. And World War II was financed about 50% with taxes and 50% with borrowing. And I think that's what needs to be done with the Green New Deal. Green New Deal is really World War II without the war. And so many of the technical advances that we're still living off of are the fruit of public investments that were made in World War II. So think about what we might have achieved if half of those investments were not made only to be blown up.
I always think that one of the elephants in the closet is the enormous amount of resources that are spent on military expenditures. Yes. You haven't mentioned this particular aspect, but we've had two decades minimum of war, on and on and on. Surely this is a terrific misallocation of resources away from social spending and so forth. Could you comment?
Well, of course I agree with that. I did not bring it up because my topic is really how to get control of finance and how to reassert the capacity of the state to govern markets and to reassert the power of trade unions. But obviously, I completely agree that too much money is spent on the military. That's just not what this particular book is about.
One of our Canada's best exports to the United States, I guess in some ways, was John Kenneth Galbraith. And I mean, you talked about his a little bit about his theory of countervailing power, and how that the countervailing power is really being destroyed in terms of the way the U.S. functions. And I'm particularly, as somebody who works in the trade union movement, I'm particularly interested in the decline of the American trade union movement, and how, I mean, which is declining rapidly, even faster than trade union movements in other OECD countries. Very, very much different from, say, Canada. where it's not in great shape here either, but not to the same extent. But on the other hand, so you've got all these things that need to be done in terms of legislation, and the hope that if there's a new progressive president, they would bring in a change in how you can unionize, the ability to unionize. But also there's been important changes in the way the economy is structured. And so there aren't the big, for people who saw the film last night, there aren't the big steel mills there in terms of to the same number, and the way that they were organized in the past is not possible. So how do you see this, and how do you see returning the American trade union movement to a much stronger force? I think it's 6% of private sector workers are unionized right now.
Well, the American trade union movement did not decline. It was mugged. And beginning with Reagan, with the air traffic controllers and all of the rules changes in American labor law, the failure of Democratic presidents, by the way, who were in bed with Wall Street to support labor law reform, to make it easier for workers to be recognized if they had a majority of people in the bargaining unit signing cards. So all of the rules of the game were tilted against unions. The fact that companies could embark on a strategy of just firing anybody who was pro-union, and by the time the law caught up with them, it would be 10 years later, and they could write this off as a cost of doing business. I think the last poll I saw was that 57% of Americans who were not members of unions said they would like to be a member of a union. So unions are more popular among regular people than they have been in a long time, with good reason. And I think some terrific organizing has been going on in the service sector. I mean, the SEIU, Service Employees Union, is a very dynamic, creative union. And I think if we can just get a reasonable set of rules, we could see an upsurge in organizing again. And yes, it's only easy to organize an auto plant with 5,000 workers in retrospect. If you look at the struggles that took place in the 30s to get that done, they were extraordinary struggles. And it took the Roosevelt administration being benignly on the side of unions. It took progressive governors, for the first time ever, refusing to send in the troops to defend property. And it took guys putting their bodies on the line in all the great sit-in strikes, et cetera, et cetera. You know the labor history probably better than I do. So I think if you at least have benevolent neutrality on the part of government, you really could see an upsurge of organizing again. But if you have the state in bed with industry suppressing unions, then it's not going to happen. Thank you.